He thought she didn't belong there, but within minutes, he would realize he had just humiliated the one woman who could end his career with a single sentence. The late afternoon sun poured through the towering glass walls of the Grand Willow estate, casting golden light across polished marble floors and rows of ivory chairs lined with fresh white roses, everything pristine, everything expensive, everything carefully curated for what was supposed to be the wedding of the season. And right in the center of it all stood Vanessa Blake, clipboard in hand, headset clipped neatly against her perfectly styled blonde hair, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. With the authority of someone who believed she controlled the entire world within those walls, every movement precise, every command unquestioned, because in her mind, perfection was not an option, it was a requirement. And anyone who didn't fit into that perfection simply didn't belong, which was exactly why her gaze froze the moment she noticed her, standing quietly near the back entrance, almost blending into the shadows, a woman in her late 30s, dressed in a simple navy dress that looked modest compared to the designer gowns and tailored suits drifting through the venue, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, as if she had no need to prove herself to anyone in that room. And yet, to Vanessa, that quiet presence felt like a disruption, like something out of place in a setting designed for exclusivity, and without hesitation, she made her way across the marble floor, heels clicking sharply with each step, drawing subtle glances from nearby staff who instantly recognized that tone, that pace, that look, the kind that meant someone was about to be corrected. "Excuse me," Vanessa said, her voice polite on the surface but edged with something colder underneath, her eyes briefly scanning the woman from head to toe, already forming a conclusion before a single word was exchanged. "This area is restricted to guests and approved staff only," she continued, tilting her head slightly as if offering a final chance for the woman to explain herself, but the woman didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even attempt to justify her presence. Instead, she simply met Vanessa's gaze with a calm steadiness that felt almost out of place in a moment charged with quiet judgment, and for a brief second, something in that silence unsettled Vanessa, but only for a second, because confidence like hers didn't allow doubt to linger. "I'm going to need you to step outside," she added, her tone firmer now, loud enough that a nearby group of guests turned slightly, curiosity flickering across their faces, the kind of attention Vanessa usually thrived on, but this time, it carried something sharper, something closer to discomfort, as whispers began to ripple through the room, subtle but unmistakable, the quiet kind of observation that turns a private moment into a public one. And still, the woman didn't react the way most people would, no embarrassment, no hurried apology, no defensive explanation, just that same composed expression, her eyes steady, her hands relaxed at her sides. As if she had seen moments like this before, as if she knew something no one else in that room did, and that was the first mistake Vanessa made, because she mistook silence for weakness, and in doing so, she set something in motion that she would not be able to stop. Vanessa's expression tightened as the silence stretched just a second too long, the kind of silence that made her feel as though she was no longer in control of the moment, and that was not something she tolerated, not here, not in front of guests who expected perfection. So she straightened her shoulders and took a small step closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound controlled, but still sharp enough to cut through the air. "I do not think you understand," she said, her tone now carrying a quiet authority that demanded compliance. "This is a private event, and everyone here has been carefully selected, so if you are not on the list, you cannot stay." And that was when a nearby server paused mid-step, holding a tray of champagne flutes, eyes flickering between the two women, sensing the tension building like pressure beneath the surface, while a couple near the aisle leaned slightly toward each other, whispering behind polite smiles, their curiosity now fully engaged, because moments like this, subtle but charged, always drew attention in places where everything was supposed to be flawless. And still, the woman did not move, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if Vanessa's words carried no weight at all, and for a brief moment, it almost felt as though the entire room had shifted around that stillness, as though everything else was noise and she alone was grounded. "I am waiting for someone," the woman said finally, her voice calm, measured, not defensive, not apologetic, just a simple statement that somehow made Vanessa's jaw tighten further, because it did not fit the narrative she had already decided, and in her world, Uncertainty was unacceptable. Then you can wait outside, Vanessa replied quickly, not giving space for interpretation, her hand gesturing firmly toward the exit doors framed by white drapery. We cannot have unverified individuals lingering near the ceremony area. And there it was, the word unverified, subtle enough to sound professional, but pointed enough to draw a few raised eyebrows from those within earshot, the kind of word that quietly separates people into categories without ever saying it outright. And as the woman glanced briefly toward the decorated aisle, her eyes resting on the arrangement of roses for just a second longer than expected, something flickered there, something almost personal, almost familiar, but it passed so quickly that Vanessa did not notice, because she was already turning slightly, signaling to one of the venue staff with a small motion of her fingers, a silent command that said this situation needed to be handled immediately, efficiently, without disrupting the illusion of perfection she had built so carefully over the past 6 months of planning. And yet, the staff member hesitated, just for a moment, his eyes shifting uncertainly toward the woman as if he recognized something he could not quite place. Something that made him pause in a way that did not go unnoticed, because Vanessa's eyes snapped back toward him instantly, irritation flashing beneath her composed exterior. Is there a problem? She asked, her voice now carrying that unmistakable edge, the one that made employees correct themselves quickly, and the staff member shook his head almost immediately, stepping forward with a forced professionalism, but the hesitation had already happened. It had already planted something invisible into the moment, something Vanessa could not see yet, but it was there, growing quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the exact moment to reveal itself, while the woman simply stood there, unmoved, her expression unchanged, as if she already knew how this was going to end, and that quiet certainty, more than anything else, was what made the air feel heavier with every passing second. The subtle hesitation from the staff member did not go unnoticed by others nearby, and in a place where every detail was meant to feel seamless, even the smallest disruption began to ripple outward, drawing quiet attention from guests who had nothing else to do but observe, and Vanessa could feel it, that shift in the atmosphere, the way conversations softened just enough for people to listen more closely, the way eyes lingered a little longer than they should, and it irritated her, because control was everything in her world, and right now, control was slipping in a way she could not quite explain, so she acted quickly, decisively, stepping forward again and positioning herself directly between the woman and the aisle, subtly blocking her view as if reclaiming the space itself. I am not going to repeat myself, Vanessa said, her voice calm but now carrying a firmness that cut through the soft hum of the venue. You need to leave this area immediately, and the word immediately landed heavier this time, final, unmistakable, the kind of tone that usually ended situations before they escalated, but not this one, because the woman simply looked at her for a moment longer, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, and then she did something unexpected. She took a small step forward instead of back, just enough to close the distance between them, not in defiance, not aggressively, but with a quiet confidence that felt entirely out of place given the circumstances, and for a brief second, Vanessa froze, caught off guard by the subtle shift, by the fact that this was not unfolding the way it was supposed to. I believe there has been a misunderstanding, the woman said softly, her voice steady, measured, and there was something in the way she spoke, something deliberate, as though every word had been chosen carefully. I was asked to be here, she continued, and this time, a few more guests turned their heads, the murmurs growing slightly louder, curiosity now fully awakened. Because there was a difference between someone being out of place and someone speaking with quiet certainty, and people could feel that difference even if they could not explain it, but Vanessa dismissed it instantly, her mind already rejecting the possibility that she could be wrong, because being wrong in front of clients, especially at a high-profile event like this, was not an option she allowed herself to consider. By who? Vanessa asked sharply, crossing her arms now, her stance firm, challenging, expecting hesitation, expecting uncertainty, expecting the kind of response that would confirm her assumption, but instead, the woman's gaze shifted briefly past her, toward the grand entrance at the far end of the hall, where sunlight streamed in through tall glass doors, illuminating the path where the bridal party would soon enter, and for a moment, her eyes softened just slightly, as if that space held meaning beyond the decorations, beyond the event itself, and then she looked back at Vanessa, her composure fully intact. That will become clear soon enough, she said, and the simplicity of the answer, the lack of urgency, the absence of any attempt to prove herself in that moment, unsettled something deeper in Vanessa, something she could not quite name, because people who did not belong usually rushed to explain themselves, they fumbled, they apologized. They tried to justify their presence, but this woman did none of those things, and that difference, that quiet refusal to play the role Vanessa had assigned her, created a tension that hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered, while just behind them, the same staff member who had hesitated earlier shifted his weight again, glancing toward the event coordinator station as if considering whether to intervene or step away, unsure which action would cause less disruption, and that uncertainty only added to the growing sense that something was unfolding beneath the surface, something that had not yet been revealed, something Vanessa could not control, no matter how firmly she tried to assert her authority, and for the first time since she had walked across that marble floor, there was the faintest flicker of doubt, quickly suppressed, but present nonetheless, because deep down, even she could feel it, this moment was not going to end the way she expected. Vanessa let out a controlled breath, the kind she used to steady herself when situations began to drift outside her carefully constructed expectations, and then she smiled, but it was not a warm smile, it was the kind designed to end conversations. To assert quiet dominance without raising her voice, soon enough is not how this works, she said, her tone now carrying a sharper edge that no longer bothered to hide its impatience. This is a private event with a strict guest list, and I personally approved every name on it, and as she spoke, she lifted her clipboard slightly, tapping it once with her pen as if that simple gesture reinforced her authority over everything within those walls. If you were supposed to be here, I would already know, she added, her gaze unwavering, confident, final, and for a moment, it seemed as though that should have ended it, because in most cases, it did, but the woman in front of her did not react the way others would. There was no visible frustration, no attempt to argue, no shift in posture that suggested discomfort. Instead, she simply stood there, her calm presence almost unmoved by the tension pressing in from all sides, and that stillness began to feel louder than any raised voice, louder than the murmurs now spreading more openly through the nearby guests, who had begun to turn fully toward the scene, their polite smiles fading into curiosity that bordered on anticipation, because something about this interaction no longer felt routine, it felt like the beginning of something they did not yet understand, and Vanessa could feel that attention settling on her shoulders, heavy, expectant, and she refused to let it turn into doubt. I am not asking again, she continued, her voice firm, controlled, but undeniably louder now, enough that a cluster of guests near the aisle went completely quiet, their conversations dissolving into silence as they watched. You need to leave before this becomes a larger issue, and the phrasing was deliberate, carefully chosen to imply consequences without stating them directly, the kind of language that usually prompted immediate compliance, but instead, the woman tilted her head ever so slightly, her eyes meeting Vanessa's with the same steady calm, and then she spoke, not loudly, not defensively, but clearly enough that those closest could hear every word. You are right about one thing, she said, and there was a softness to her tone that contrasted sharply with the tension around them. This is a very important event. And for a brief second, Vanessa almost felt a flicker of validation, as if the woman was finally acknowledging the authority she held, but that feeling vanished just as quickly as it appeared, because the woman continued, her gaze drifting once more toward the entrance, where a black luxury sedan had just come to a smooth stop outside the tall glass doors, barely noticeable to most, but not to her, which is exactly why I would suggest you be careful with how you handle this moment. She finished, and something about the way she said it, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a simple observation, sent a subtle chill through the air, because it carried an underlying certainty that did not match her appearance, did not match the role Vanessa had assigned her, and that mismatch was what made it unsettling, because it hinted at something unseen, something just out of reach, and as the doors at the far end began to open, letting in a stream of warm light that stretched across the marble floor, a few heads turned instinctively toward the entrance, drawn by movement, by timing, by something that felt just slightly too precise to be coincidence, while Vanessa remained focused on the woman in front of her, determined to end this before it escalated any further, unaware that the moment she was trying so hard to control had already begun to slip beyond her grasp, and the truth, whatever it was was now only seconds away from stepping into the room. The soft hum of conversation near the entrance faded almost instantly as the tall glass doors opened wider, letting in a wash of golden light that stretched across the marble floor like a spotlight, and with it came a shift in the room that was impossible to ignore. Subtle at first, then undeniable, as several heads turned in unison, drawn not just by movement but by presence, the kind that did not need an announcement to command attention, and the man who stepped inside carried that presence effortlessly, his dark tailored suit fitting perfectly, his posture relaxed but purposeful, the kind of confidence that came from years of being recognized without needing to introduce himself, and beside him walked an older gentleman in a charcoal suit, his expression composed but attentive, as if he were observing everything with quiet authority, and as they crossed the threshold, a few members of the venue staff straightened instinctively, their posture shifting in a way that did not go unnoticed by those nearby, because respect like that was never random, it was earned, and it meant something, and yet, Vanessa remained focused on the woman in front of her, determined to finish what she had started, unaware that the atmosphere around her had already begun to change. "This is your final warning," she said, her voice low but firm, her patience thinning with each passing second. "If you do not leave now, I will have security escort you out." And the word security landed heavier than anything she had said before, enough to draw a few quiet gasps from those closest to the scene, because now it had crossed into something more public, more serious, more difficult to ignore. But the woman did not react with fear or urgency. Instead, she simply glanced past Vanessa once more, her eyes briefly settling on the man who had just entered, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of recognition in her expression, not surprise, not relief, but something deeper, something familiar, as if this moment had been expected all along. And then she looked back at Vanessa, her calm unwavering. "That will not be necessary," she said softly, and there was a quiet certainty in her voice that felt completely out of place given the situation. But before Vanessa could respond, before she could assert her authority again, a voice cut through the tension from behind her, clear, composed, and unmistakably directed. "Is there a reason you are asking her to leave?" the man asked, his tone polite but carrying an underlying firmness that immediately shifted the dynamic of the moment, and Vanessa turned sharply, her expression already preparing to explain, to justify, to regain control. But the second her eyes met his, something changed, just slightly, just enough to register, because this was not just another guest, this was someone important, someone whose presence carried weight beyond the guest list she held in her hand, and for a fraction of a second, her confidence faltered, barely visible, but there, and as the room grew quieter, as conversations faded into a hush that spread outward like a ripple, every eye now fixed on the unfolding scene, the woman remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, still, composed, her gaze steady, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, because while Vanessa believed she was controlling the situation, the truth was already stepping into the room, and it was only a matter of seconds before everything she assumed would begin to unravel. Vanessa straightened instinctively, her posture shifting into the polished professionalism she had perfected over years of handling high-profile clients, but there was a slight delay, a fraction of a second where her confidence did not land as smoothly as it usually did. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," she said quickly, her tone measured, controlled, as she turned fully toward the man. "This individual is not on the approved guest list, and I am simply ensuring that the integrity of the event is maintained." And her words sounded right, they always did, carefully structured, neutral, professional, but something about the way they hung in the air this time felt different, as though they were being weighed rather than accepted, and the man's gaze shifted briefly past her, landing on the woman who had remained still through it all, and in that moment, the tension changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that was unmistakable to anyone paying attention, because recognition replaced curiosity, and respect followed closely behind it. "Emily," the man said, his voice softening slightly, but still carrying that same quiet authority, and the name itself seemed to echo in the space between them, subtle, but enough to trigger something in the room, a shift in perception, because names mattered, and the way he said it mattered even more. And Vanessa felt it immediately, that flicker of uncertainty returning, stronger this time, because this was not how someone addressed a stranger, this was familiarity, this was acknowledgment, and for the first time since the interaction began, her certainty cracked just slightly, I apologize for the delay, he continued, stepping closer now, his attention no longer on Vanessa, but fully on the woman, Emily, and as he did, the older gentleman who had entered with him paused just behind, observing quietly, his expression unreadable but attentive, as if he already understood more than most. Everything is ready, the man added, his tone respectful, almost deferential, and that was the moment the room shifted completely. Because respect like that did not go unnoticed, especially not in a place where hierarchy defined everything, and a quiet murmur moved through the guests, subtle but growing, as pieces began to connect in ways that Vanessa had not anticipated, and she felt it, that realization forming just out of reach, something she could not yet fully grasp, but it was there, pressing in, demanding attention. I see, Vanessa said, her voice slightly tighter now, though she tried to maintain composure. If there has been a mistake, I can certainly review the list again, and she glanced down at her clipboard as if it could anchor her back into control, but the action felt smaller now, less certain, because the authority she had relied on moments ago no longer carried the same weight, not in the presence of whatever this was becoming, and Emily simply looked at her for a brief moment, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, before shifting her attention back to the man, as if the situation had already resolved itself in her mind, and that quiet dismissal, unspoken but clear, landed heavier than any confrontation could have, because it revealed something Vanessa had not considered. She had never truly been the one in control, not of the moment, not of the outcome, and as the room settled into a silence that felt charged with anticipation, the truth stood right there, no longer hidden, just waiting for Vanessa to see it clearly, and once she did, there would be no going back. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her clipboard, the subtle shift betraying the composure she was trying to maintain, because the way the man had said that name, Emily, it lingered in the air with a weight she could not ignore. And as her eyes moved between them, searching for something to anchor herself back into certainty, she began to notice the details she had overlooked before, the way the staff member who had hesitated earlier now stood straighter, his attention fixed on Emily with a quiet respect, the way the older gentleman near the entrance had stepped just slightly closer, not to intervene, but to observe with the calm assurance of someone who already understood the situation completely, and most of all, the way the man in front of her had shifted his stance, no longer addressing her as the authority in the room, but as someone secondary, someone who had unknowingly stepped out of place. We can proceed when you are ready, he said to Emily, his tone measured, respectful, and that single sentence carried more weight than anything Vanessa had said in the past several minutes, because it implied something she had not prepared for, something she had not accounted for in her perfectly structured plan, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the quiet stretching into something almost tangible, as guests exchanged glances, their earlier curiosity now transforming into realization, slow but undeniable, like a puzzle finally coming together piece by piece, and Vanessa felt it, that shift happening around her, the ground beneath her certainty beginning to crack in ways she could not control. I believe there has been a misunderstanding, she said again, but this time, her voice lacked the sharp confidence it once held, softened by uncertainty she could no longer fully conceal, and as she glanced down at her clipboard, flipping a page as if searching for confirmation, for proof that she was still right, the action felt smaller now, almost insignificant compared to what was unfolding in front of her. Your name was not listed in the final approval, she added, though even as she spoke, the words sounded less certain, more like a defense than a declaration, and Emily watched her quietly, her expression unchanged, not triumphant, not offended, just calm, as if this moment had already passed in her mind, and then she spoke, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach those closest. That is because I do not need to be approved, she said, and the simplicity of the statement landed with a clarity that cut through the tension like a clean line, and for a brief second, no one moved, no one spoke, because the meaning behind those words was beginning to settle, slowly, heavily, and Vanessa blinked, her mind catching up, trying to process what she had just heard, but before she could respond, before she could question it, the older gentleman stepped forward slightly, his presence quiet but undeniable, and when he spoke, his voice carried a calm authority that did not need to raise itself to be heard. Miss Carter has been overseeing this property long before today's event was ever scheduled, he said, his gaze steady, directed not just at Vanessa, but at the moment itself, as if placing the truth exactly where it belonged. And the effect was immediate. The murmurs stopped, the air stilled, and Vanessa felt it fully this time, the realization landing with a weight she could not deflect, because this was not a misunderstanding, this was something far more consequential, something that had been there from the beginning, hidden in plain sight, and now, with every eye in the room turning toward her, the truth was no longer waiting, it had arrived, and there was nothing she could do to undo what had already been set in motion. The words seemed to echo longer than they should have, settling into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, and for a moment everything slowed, the quiet becoming almost overwhelming as realization moved through the crowd like a ripple, subtle at first, then undeniable, because people understood what that meant. They understood what it meant when someone did not need approval to be there, and more importantly, who had the authority to say something like that without hesitation, and Vanessa felt it fully now, the shift in every direction, the way the attention that had once supported her authority had turned, now observing her with a different kind of curiosity, one that no longer assumed she was right, and for the first time since the interaction began, she did not speak immediately, her mind racing to catch up, to reconstruct a situation that had already slipped beyond her control. "I was not informed," she said finally, her voice quieter, the sharp edge replaced with something more uncertain, more careful, as if every word now carried consequences she had not anticipated, and Emily looked at her for a brief moment, her expression still composed, still steady, but there was something else there now, not superiority, not anger, just clarity, the kind that came from understanding exactly where everyone stood. "That is because I prefer to observe before I intervene," Emily replied calmly, her voice even, measured, carrying just enough to reach those closest without needing to rise, and that answer, simple as it was, carried a quiet authority that made everything else fall into place, because it explained the silence, the stillness, the patience. She had never been uncertain, she had been watching, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it had, and Vanessa felt that realization settle deeper, heavier, because it meant this had not been a misunderstanding, it had been a test, one she had already failed before realizing she was part of it, and around them, the staff began to shift subtly, their posture changing, their attention now directed toward Emily in a way that made the hierarchy unmistakable, because respect like that could not be forced, it revealed itself naturally, and the man who had addressed her earlier stepped slightly to the side, giving her space, not out of formality, but out of recognition, and that movement alone said more than any explanation could. "We have ensured every detail aligns with your standards," he said, his tone respectful, almost careful, as if acknowledging the weight of her presence, and Vanessa stood there, her clipboard now lowered slightly at her side, no longer the symbol of control it had been moments ago, because in the presence of what had just been revealed, it meant very little, and she glanced briefly at the guests, noticing the way their expressions had changed, the way the quiet judgment she had once directed outward had now returned, not harshly, but unmistakably, and it was in that moment, standing in the center of a room she thought she controlled, that Vanessa understood something she had not considered before. Authority was not something you claimed, it was something others recognized, and she had mistaken her role for ownership, her responsibility for power, and that mistake had led her here, to a moment she could not undo, and Emily simply gave a small nod, acknowledging the man beside her, her attention already shifting toward the ceremony space as if the situation had resolved itself completely, because for her, it had, and as the room slowly returned to motion, the silence breaking into quiet conversation once more, Vanessa remained still for just a second longer, the weight of the moment settling in fully, because she knew, even without anyone saying it, that everything had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could never be reversed. The music resumed softly, almost as if the room itself was trying to recover from the moment that had just passed, but the shift lingered, subtle yet permanent, woven into every glance, every whisper, every movement that followed, and Vanessa felt it with every step she took as she slowly straightened her posture. Again, her grip tightening briefly around her clipboard before she lowered it completely, no longer using it as a shield, because she understood now that it offered none, not here, not in front of the person who had quietly revealed the truth without raising her voice, and as Emily moved forward toward the ceremony space, her steps calm and unhurried, the staff adjusted around her instinctively, creating space without being asked. their attention aligning naturally with her presence, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, and that difference was unmistakable, because it was the kind of respect that could not be demanded, only earned, and the man who had greeted her earlier remained just slightly behind her, his posture attentive, ready but not intrusive, as if he understood exactly where his place was in that moment, while the older gentleman gave a small approving nod, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's with a quiet acknowledgment that needed no words, and for those watching, the scene spoke louder than any explanation could have, because everything had already been said, just not in the way they expected, and Vanessa stood there for a second longer than she should have, aware of the eyes that had once looked to her for direction now observing her differently, not harshly, not openly critical, but with a subtle shift that carried its own message, and she exhaled slowly, the realization settling fully, not as humiliation, but as clarity, because in that moment, she understood exactly where she had gone wrong, not in enforcing rules, not in maintaining order, but in assuming that appearance defined authority, in believing that confidence alone meant control, and as she finally stepped aside, allowing the moment to move forward without her interference, it was not a retreat, it was an adjustment, a quiet acknowledgement of something she had overlooked, and Emily paused briefly near the front row, her gaze drifting across the carefully arranged seats, the white roses, the soft light filtering through the glass, and for a moment, her expression softened, not with triumph, but with something deeper, something personal, as if this place held meaning beyond the event itself, and then she turned slightly, her eyes meeting Vanessa's just once more, not to confront, not to remind, but simply to acknowledge, and there was no anger there, no judgment, just a calm presence that carried a lesson far stronger than any words could deliver. Because it did not need to be spoken, it was already understood, and as the guests settled into their seats and the ceremony prepared to begin, the room returned to its polished perfection, but beneath it, something had changed, something quieter, something lasting, a reminder that respect is not granted by position or appearance, but revealed through character, and on that day, in a room filled with elegance and expectation, the world paused just long enough to remember what dignity truly looks like.